Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, whether it's morning, afternoon, evening. Thank you for being here with us. And welcome to this special International Women's Day office hour with Christine Silva, Emma Mohns, and Dave Wilkin. So my name is Jill Garner, and I am the Program Director for Academic and Social Impact here at 10,000 Coffees. I want to start off today's event by acknowledging that we are meeting on the land that is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 and the Mississaugas of the Credit. I'd also like to thank RBC Future Launch for generously supporting your institution's 10KC program and for making this office hour possible. As you can see on the slide, and as Dave mentioned, we would love if you would post on social media using the tags on this slide. Tuesday was International Women's Day, but March is Women's History Month. So we want to keep the conversation going all throughout the month. All right, so I'm gonna launch our first poll of the day. You should see a pop-up window momentarily. So we would love to know what types of mentoring, networking, learning experiences that you have participated in. So I'm going to leave that poll running while I talk a bit more about 10,000 Coffees, and then I'll share the results in a couple of minutes. So I wanted to first off say welcome to those who are joining your first office hour, and congratulations, because you are now a member of your institution's 10,000 Coffees community. So through 10KC, you now have access to a number of different ways to explore mentoring and networking. So through 10,000 Coffees, you'll be able to grow your network through what we call introductions. On a regular cadence, you'll receive a new introduction to someone from your academic community. This could be an alumni, it could be a peer, and this is really your opportunity to grow your network and practice those networking skills. Since you're joining us today, you have clearly already learned about one of the other amazing offerings through your school's 10KC community, which is office hours. Office hours are an opportunity to hear from alumni, recruiters, subject matter experts, and people who can provide you with skills and career development opportunities. And then the last piece I want to highlight here is our member directory. So each of you now has access to a directory of people within your school's community. So you can reach out to peers or potential mentors using this feature, and everyone is on there to connect. So it's a great way to network with others from your community. If you have signed up for introductions, you're going to receive these directly into your inbox. So from that email, you can reach straight out to that person, and we encourage you to do that as soon as you receive it. We know it is tougher than ever these days to expand your network. So this is a really safe way to connect with others who are there to do the exact same thing. And through office hours like today and those that are put on by your school, you'll have access to conversations that will help you boost your understanding of the job market, help you learn about the industries you're interested in, or hear about people's career paths. They aren't always as linear as we think that they can be, so it can be really interesting to hear how someone gets from point A to point B. So we encourage you, if you're not already leveraging all of the features on your school's 10KC community, to start doing so today. And now I'm going to check in with our poll. Bear with me while I share the exciting results. So it looks like 64% of people on here have participated in some form of networking. That is awesome. 59% mentoring, 53% networks, groups, and associations, 24% onboarding and buddies, and 16% none yet. But now that you're a part of your 10KC community, the world is your oyster. All right, with that, I'm going to pass it back to Dave to kick off the event. Thanks, guys.
Well, first off, it's a big privilege to get to join these panelists today as an ally. So much of celebrating women in our lives is about being an ally and getting involved. And as an LGBT entrepreneur myself, the role of allies is important in all different shapes and forms. And so thank you for letting me host this panel. And through International Women's Day and also throughout the month, it's a chance for all of us to educate and figure out how we can create more networks, to create more inclusive environments, and ultimately help grow careers of people in all different minority groups. So thanks for letting me host this as the Ally. We have a jam-packed agenda, and I'm going to introduce our panelists in just a second, but just for the audience, we've kind of got a 3-part webinar planned for you. The first, in a theme of International Women's Day, the first part is really about identifying the bias. So I think most people know that Break the Bias is the theme this year, and we need to understand what the bias is. And it's a bit of a tough conversation, but I think it's important to start there. And so please bear with us as we jump into some of that in that first chapter, and let's have a really open dialogue to explore what those biases are. So it might be a bit heavy at the first chapter, but I think it's important for us to understand the bias before we get into the second chapter, which is on tactics and solutions. Like, how can we all play a part as individuals, as organizations? Maybe some of you run clubs or societies with your campus or your alumni network. And so the second chapter is about what we can all do. And then the third is a Q&A. So if you didn't catch this already, you can use the chat to share questions. I've got a lot of questions here already, but I'll be following along closely to the questions that are submitted by all of you. I'd also say, if you didn't do this already, introduce yourself. We've got people from all over the world. We have professionals working at all different companies. We have students and recent grads. If nothing else, build your network through these office hours. And a great way to do that is introduce yourself on the chat, direct it to everybody, and include your LinkedIn. And so people can follow up and start to meet new people as well. So that's a high level flow of the event. And now I am very excited to introduce our panelists. So first, I will introduce Christine Silva, who's the Senior Lead of Community Engagement at Shopify. So Christine, I think many of us have probably bought things through Shopify stores. And Christine works with global merchants around the world. She was previously at RBC leading talent and innovation programs. Christine is one of my go-to people on anything DE&I, talent, mentoring, innovation, to name a few. And so I'm so excited to have Christine on here to ask her a ton of skill testing questions and share her knowledge with all of you. Thanks for joining, Christine.
Thanks, Dave.
And next is Emma Mohns, and she's the Senior Legal Counsel at Kinaxis. So Kinaxis, you might not know it, but you probably interacted with their technology, given that they're a publicly traded supply chain software company. Emma completed her law degree at the University of Ottawa. She's now on the board of the Trans-Canada Trail, and she's somebody who's been very involved in networking and mentoring with Indigenous communities in a variety of ways, in particular with the Trans-Canada Trail. So Emma, thanks for joining. So I'm going to start with some lightning round questions, and just to get things, spiced up and get into all the content. So first, and we'll start with Christine and then go to Emma, would love for you to just introduce yourself and tell us a bit about what you do in your role and also in your spare time.
Sure. So Dave mentioned I'm at Shopify. I've been there less than a year. But what my team focuses on is building community amongst the merchants, the business owners who use Shopify, and programs to help them learn and connect with each other, network. But my whole background before that was in talent, helping employees connect with each other. And the part of my career background that Dave didn't mention is I actually started my career doing research on careers with a focus on gender and diversity. So super passionate about that. And then Dave, did you say what I do in my spare time? Was that your next question? So I have a 3-year-old.
A few hobbies, yeah.
I have a 3-year-old, so my spare time is all playing with blocks and reading books and going to the park. I feel like I used to have spare time, but in short supply these days.
Emma.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. So my name's Emma. I'm a lawyer at Kinaxis, which Dave introduced. And when I joined 5 years ago, it was really hard to explain to my parents what Kinaxis does. But after we've all gone through the great toilet paper shortage of 2020, and it's taken me 6 months to wait for a new vehicle right now, I think we all understand why large companies would need something like Kinaxis that helps them plan for disruption in their supply chains. So that's what I do at Kinaxis. I have a really broad legal role here. I negotiate contracts, but I also work in corporate governance, which lately there's a lot of work in corporate governance to increase diversity on boards. So that work is really interesting to me. I also have a toddler, I have a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old. So my spare time is puzzles, Paw Patrol, a little bit of running where I can fit it in, but like Christine, it's a little bit in short supply.
So coffee, tea, or something else, Christine and then Emma.
If I'm ordering something out, a chai latte with lactose-free milk, but honestly, it's mostly water at my desk. I've got a water bottle here.
Good for you. I am recovering from a coffee addiction, so it's tea for me for now.
So if you could live in any other country, where would it be? We'll keep going in the same order through these questions.
I can narrow it down to cities. If I was in Europe, it would be Amsterdam. If I was in the US, it would be Chicago. Those are cities I've been to that just felt kind of like home when I was there, which is, I guess, weird to pick another country and make it feel familiar, but the diversity and the beauty of Amsterdam, high on my list.
I am not very well traveled. So of the few places I have been, I fell in love with Ireland just because it's kind of slow and small town, like where I grew up. So that's my pick.
So dream job, unrelated to what you're doing today.
I would have picked casting director. I directed plays back when I was in school, and by far my favorite part was like picking who was going to be in what role, because depending on who you slotted in, the show was totally different on stage. And to be honest, I think that's why I was drawn to talent, because it's very similar to who you put in what role on a team, and how the team is going to feel very different.
You saw my jaw drop because that is also my dream job, but I have not put that much thought into it. I just always thought it was cool. I always think about when I'm watching films who I would have casted. That is crazy that we have the same one.
This was not planned, by the way.
No.
This is fully coincidence. And lastly is, what's a book that everybody should read?
Okay, I'm super biased, but I would say Lean In by Cheryl Sandberg. She's a senior leader at Facebook, and it was several years ago now that she wrote it, but she covers a lot of sort of tips on what women can do to sort of lean into their career. I will say she got a lot of criticism when the book came out because it doesn't call out what companies can do to be more inclusive. She also speaks from a position of privilege, very senior executive, lots of sort of resources that other women don't have, but still it's a sort of research-based book. I'm biased because my research is also in that book, but a lot of good takeaways and just reminders of things we can all do in our career.
Yeah, so for me, there's lots of good professional development books, but I think what I always ask people to read are the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I think until everybody in this country has read those, I don't have a lot else to recommend right now.
Well said. So let's get into some of the breaking the bias concepts. And as I said, this is the first third of the session. We're going to get kind of deep into some of those things that I think are important for all of us to start with. So Christine, I know you've talked through some of the early research that you built your career in at Catalyst into women's careers. Can you share some of those findings into how men and women's experiences differ entering, but also navigating the world of work?
Yeah, so Catalyst is a global nonprofit based in New York, but I was in the Toronto office and studying careers of women and men around the world. I worked on some series that were specific to minorities, some specific to LGBT employees. Most of what I focused though on was women, and we followed literally thousands of women's careers in one series after they finished their MBA. And we found that in their first job after their MBA, women started in lower levels than men, earned less than men, even after we controlled for what industry, were they working in, how many years of prior work experience did they have, what their aspirations were. So we were building these statistical models to kind of control for a lot of things you would expect to affect careers. And gender, being a woman, sort of was a significant factor in where you started. And what was important Two is we found over time that gap grew bigger. A lot of people get promotions that are sort of a percentage of what they made. So that sort of smaller gap at the beginning got bigger over time. We looked at what tactics women and men use to get ahead in their career, and women and men were using all the same tactics, but they were benefiting men more. There's other research that we sort of took inspiration from. I wasn't necessarily part of doing it, but things that showed biases that are out there. Experiments where researchers would change the name on a resume, identical resumes, but is it Kevin or is it Karen? And if the resume is Karen, the people reading it would put more doubt-raising statements, is what the researchers called it. Like, how do we know what her role was on this project? I would want to see performance evaluations. I would want to ask more questions. And so literally the same information, if it was a woman's name on it, the result was different. People were more likely to want to hire Kevin versus Karen, offer a higher salary. Other research on negotiations, actors literally using the exact same script for a salary negotiation. People responded better to the men who were, same language, same mannerisms, trained actors doing it. And anyways, I mean, I can go on and on. As Dave said, it's a bit depressing to sort of spend time in the research around bias. But it's so important as a starting point, like understand some of the reality of what experiences are, and know that it's not, especially if you're feeling it, that it's not just you, this is something bigger going on, and then take inspiration from that research and figure out, given that, what can we do about it?
Yeah, I mean, especially as an ally, I think it's really important to be open to some of these harder conversations, and to be open to, like, a lot of, whenever there's bias, which is prevalent everywhere, we've got to be open to just like talk about some of those issues, and not get defensive by the fact that, it might be a bit tough to hear. So yeah, thanks for sharing that.
I'll add, because you mentioned not to get defensive, it's not like these were biases that men had about women. It was women and men both made the same assessments about women's resumes. So it's just so pervasive. It's not like we can sort of point a finger at one group and say, they're the ones who hold these biases. Women have the same biases. Yeah,
that's well said. And we'll link some of the Catalyst research in here for folks just to take a read. So Emma, you've been in legal practice, you worked in tech M&A, you now are at one of the, like, Canada's probably most impressive technology companies in their legal practice. So you've probably seen a lot, and you're probably often the only woman in the room in a lot of these situations. What barriers have you had to overcome in your career? And as a woman in these rooms, have you ever encountered bias or explicit discrimination?
I think that for me, I've been pretty lucky in that, in terms of being a woman, often the only woman in the room, it's more the barriers that I'm experiencing, as opposed to the explicit bias. Not that it's easy to overcome barriers, but one of the ones that I noticed right away that's really prevalent in the legal industry especially, is in terms of networking. So where, it's quite easy for a junior male lawyer to go golfing for an afternoon and really get to know the male partners, the older partners. It's tricky for women. We don't have those sort of obvious networking opportunities. And, when you're working really long hours as a junior lawyer, you kind of head down, and your assumption is that your hard work is going to, equal success one day. And it's just not, I don't think it's true. And so having to be really creative compared to some of the male counterparts, that was really tricky. And I learned that almost immediately as soon as I entered the profession. The other thing that I find interesting and sometimes tricky to manage are people's assumptions about me as a woman, people's assumptions about me as a working mom. And, for instance, leaving private practice, an assumption is made that it's because you want to spend more time with your family. So just kind of navigating what those assumptions are and trying to correct them or deal with them in your own way. The one more thing that I'll mention in terms of, again, it's a barrier, but I didn't experience it in a biased way, is maternity leave. So we're very lucky in Canada to get time off to spend with our kids, and it's our choice. I took 8 months in each case. You can take 12 months, 18 months, wonderful. But it's kind of a double-edged sword in some ways, because you've left your role for 8 months or whatever it is. And, if even if you're fully supported by your workplace, you have to figure out how to reinsert yourself in a lot of things. So that was a tricky thing to overcome.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So we've got a poll question to get some folks on this webinar to share some feedback. So what do you think is the most important thing allies can do to support women's careers? So this is, we're gonna get into the topic of allies in just a second. So we'd love to get everyone's thoughts on this. And kind of as people are sharing some of their feedback on it, that leads us to the next question, which is the role of allies. And yes, and I see in the chat that people would like to pick more than one. So you'll have to pick your favorite one, but feel free to use the chat to share your second or third best pick as well, if you'd like. We can keep using that chat as we go. So we're going to go to the next question for Christine and Emma. What role do allies play in supporting women's career development? Tell us about allyship that you've witnessed or experienced. So Christine, maybe I'll start with you and then pass it over to Emma.
Sure. Emma hit on a lot of themes that we saw sort of consistently in our research about barriers, actually not only just women, but the research on minorities, LGBT employees, a lot of similar themes that came up around like stereotypes and assumptions, lack of access to networks. You mentioned golfing, lack of role models was another one. So in my mind, and I don't know if this one was on the list, but a big role allies can play is inviting people into spaces, like actively inviting them in, not just assume that they're going to be, that they're going to feel welcome. Dave, you mentioned at the top, you know, some of the folks on this call might be leaders of clubs. How do you make sure it's a very inclusive and welcoming space for people who might not look like you? Or like create spaces if you have an opportunity to do so, create spaces where people feel included. But certainly advocacy, speaking up. A lot of women don't feel comfortable, like one of the expressions is like tooting your own horn, talking about the great things you've done. And if you see someone who has a hard time talking about how great they are, speak up for them. And like, maybe you make a deal to hype each other up, right? And like tell those stories, whether it's at school, on social media, whatever that looks like, on LinkedIn. So like tag people, bring visibility to what they've done. Some of the allies that I've seen who do a great job are sort of inviting people into conversations. Personally, something I've experienced is like one very senior male executive where I used to work invited me to speak to the board of directors. That is not a space that many younger women, I mean, very few people get to go anyways, but especially not younger women. And so like that kind of advocacy, that kind of vouching for me as someone who has something valuable to say there. So invite people in every opportunity you have.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just add in along a similar vein, each of the sort of sponsors that I'm lucky to have in my career right now are really good at, if I'm quiet in a meeting, because maybe in my mind, everybody's sort of covered all of the areas that I'd want to contribute to, they'll just probe and say, hey, Emma, did you have anything to add? Which I think is just really helpful for those of us who, you know, I'm pretty deferential, so I'll sit there and go, everybody's covered some really good points already. So I think that's something that I've seen and that's been done for me, which is really helpful. And then the other thing that I see a lot in my workplace, which I love, is, you know, when somebody reaches out and asks you to do something, if one of your colleagues is well suited to do it and maybe better suited to do it or would like the opportunity to do it, I'll pass it along and say, you know, this person is really good at this and this is who you should work with this time, just to sort of gently put someone else's hand up for things.
Yeah, both really good examples. And I think we all can play, like everyone can play a role as an ally, no matter what. And I think, you know, one of the things that I would share with everybody is, I think there's, on a spectrum of allyship, on one hand, I think the first is just educate yourself and learn. The least everybody can do is just try to learn about some of these barriers and educate themselves as a starting point. And on the other side of an ally is like, find a way to help. You know, look at people who are underrepresented in places and just ask them, how can I help? Or find ways to do that, whether it's making introductions to help them grow their network, whether it's advocating for them when they're not in the room, or whether it's finding ways just to like bringing them into rooms to get more exposure to show how their skills are and how talented they might be. So Lots of different roles of an ally. On one end, just go and read online and get educated. Some of the things that Emma had shared earlier are a good place to start. And on the other hand, just act. Find a way to actually act on things and help people. And some great feedback from the survey. One of the biggest things is to advocate, absolutely. Call out inequality. I think that's a really important one, where if you're seeing things that are not really fair or not equal, as somebody who might be of the majority in that situation, it's really on you to call it out. Don't try to make people who are underrepresented be the ones that are also fighting for these situations. So for example, as a male in tech, it's up to me to call those things and not rely on my female colleagues to try to advocate for themselves. They already have enough barriers. It's really up to us. So some really good answers. Any thoughts on this, Emma, Christine, on some of these replies or the responses?
I think you did a good job on the calling out, and like, especially for things even that seem really small, seem like probably not a big deal, probably no one took offense. That's almost the best time to call it out, before things get bigger, and just to let people know that there's someone there who's paying attention and who wants to make sure things are like, it's inclusive, it's a safe space, everyone feels welcome.
Yeah, and I think the active listening one, I should have mentioned that too, because when things happen in other people's lives that aren't really impacting you, and I'll use the example of the grapes from residential schools last year, for instance. I had probably 5 colleagues reach out to me just to see how I'm doing, and having them practice active listening and actually asking how things are going. I think in a lot of cases we avoid more difficult conversations, but that active listening and just seeking out how people are doing is one of the most important, is very underrated.
If I can also comment on the one about giving credit where credit's due. I don't know if you've all had this experience, but like, you say something in a meeting and then a little bit of time passes, someone else says the same idea and everyone's like, oh, such a good idea. And you're sitting there like, I can't now say, wait a second, that was my idea. That feels really awkward to do, but someone else can say that for you. And I've been in that meeting where someone's like, didn't Christine say that? I do think that was a good idea. So like, if you notice that happening, speak up and make sure that original person got credit, especially if they're not the loudest, most vocal person in the room. I see at least one person, Marlena on the chat, has had that experience before, and it's so frustrating, and you just sit there like, I know that was my idea. Anyway, so definitely, like, you can be part of that giving credit where it's due if you just witness that happening, and just make sure that person has gets that recognition.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to get into some of the tactics to overcome. Again, the theme is breaking the bias, and so let's get into some tactics. So Christine, maybe starting with you and going back to your time as Catalyst or within Catalyst, what were some of the tactics or actions your research uncovered that can actually help women overcome barriers and succeed?
Yeah, we spent time digging into both what companies can do and what individuals can do. And on the company front, there's a lot. You're reviewing HR data, finding gaps, closing gaps, putting mentoring programs in place, networking programs. 10,000 Coffees is a perfect example where I worked before. We used 10,000 Coffees to help people find each other and build those relationships, just like you can do as a student. A lot of companies, you can do that as an employee too. But really focusing on what individuals can do. One of the studies we did that really stuck with me the most was we had given people a list of more than 20 tactics that they might be using to get ahead in their career, and just ask them which of these things are you doing. And everything from like meeting with recruiters, getting more education, like all different things you could be doing to advance. And women and men were doing all the same things in the same patterns, and for men, literally anything they did predicted, this is so depressing, predicted advancement, predicted compensation growth. And for women, only 2 tactics of the 25-ish that we studied predicted advancement and compensation growth, which in a way is like a bit sad that only 2 tactics were sort of significant for women. But on the other hand, it makes it easier to know where to focus. So those 2 tactics that predicted getting ahead in your career were networking with influential people and making your achievements known. And why those 2 things are so important is that's how you go about getting sponsorship. So different from mentors, mentors are the people who talk with you, they give you advice, they help you bounce around ideas. A sponsor is someone who behind the scenes is talking about you. So saying like, oh, Emma's fantastic, you have to meet her. She'll have great ideas for you. She's someone you want to hire. They're like actively advocating for you. And it can be hard to know if those conversations are happening about you. So it's like, how do you make sure that the people who are in a position to talk about you are equipped with stories worth telling? Hence the like making your achievements known. And it's hard to go and ask someone to be your sponsor. It can almost be easier to transition a relationship where someone's giving you advice and then sort of as you build that relationship say, hey, I'm considering applying for a role at, you know, so-and-so team or so-and-so company. Could you put in a good word for me? Could you be a referral for me? If you're applying to any job at a company where there's a space that says like, is there anyone who's referring you? Like, look up anyone you know at that company, have a conversation with them, have them refer you. That's sort of like the initial type of sponsorship you want, someone who's going to sort of put their name out or put their name on the line and say, yep, this is a great person. Anyways, so definitely thinking about sponsorship. Another tactic I'd say, oh, sorry, I can like talk about this forever. I will try to be quick. But another tactic I would say is like when applying for roles, there sort of is this idea that men will apply for roles if they only check some of the boxes, women will apply for roles only when they check all of the boxes. And there's kind of advice for women to behave more like men, apply to roles even if you don't check all the boxes. Which I get it is well-meaning advice, but the research sort of says people will raise those doubt-raising statements, like I said before. So what the takeaway there is spend extra time as you think about your resume, as you think about your interview, what are the proof points you can offer about how you've got the skills needed to do the job? You don't have to have done the exact job before. I actually agree with the notion of apply for a job before you check all the boxes, but prove that you've got the right foundation. You've got transferable skills. You had, I know when I was getting my first role, I was leaning on my experiences as a student doing student council and school paper and theater and those kinds of activities. Like, where do you have some leadership experience that you can describe, or other skills that you've built? So it's like, it is a bit of a tip around over preparing, maybe is like, and have someone else read your resume and ask them, am I giving enough evidence that I could be really strong in this role? Like, have someone read it with fresh eyes there. So please apply for jobs where you don't check all the boxes, but give some extra thought to like, can I add more oomph to this resume that shows that I've got really great transferable skills that will set me up for success in the role?
Yeah, that's so many good tactics. And I think sponsorship, there's a ton of great resources online, but with everybody on here, you of course get to build networks and mentoring experiences on your 10,000 Coffees school community, and just find ways to start building those relationships and see how you can turn those into sponsorship moments. So just going off of some of that research, maybe I'll pass it over to on more a personal note, I guess, is just what are some of those tactics that have worked for you? And Emma, maybe you can start and then we'll pass it to Christine.
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things that I've started to do more recently on the theme of sponsorship is you've got this great relationship with your sponsor. And so you can sort of start to direct what you want to learn from them. So for me, for instance, I recently read about what's called the missing 33%. So a lot of sponsors will help women further develop their soft skills, but a lot of male sponsors of men will help them learn about business and strategy and the financial aspect of things. You need both, but for me, I think I'm probably missing a lot of that 33%, that's the finance piece. So trying to direct my sponsorship to take me exactly where I need to go. And then another thing that's helped me as a talked about how networking can be kind of difficult for me. It's not really my thing, but when I personalized my networking experience, it completely changed things. So, I'm no longer going to mixers or cocktail hours or whatever because it didn't work for me. But I joined the Trans Canada Trail Board, and my network has grown exponentially, and I'm really passionate about it. So you're doing good work because you're enjoying it, but then you're also expanding your network. So two big things that have worked for me.
And for me, I know I mentioned it briefly, but this idea of elevating sort of people in your network, elevating might not be the right word, but anyways, turning past like managers into sponsors, and how do you help them like go through that journey of a relationship with you? So I had probably two who stand out in my mind where they were a manager of mine. And then when they moved to a different role, I then leaned on them in a different way. Like they were still an important part of my network. I want to call out actually, Jess in the chat raised the idea of like, ask others what skills they think you're good at. They might see something you don't. And that's something these two, both of them women, something they did for me is they suggested things that I could do next. They said, hey, you might want to talk to someone over here. And so I'd have sort of increasingly open conversations with them where I didn't have to necessarily have all the answers of what I wanted to do next, but a bit of a sense of like, I think I'm ready to make a change. What have you seen that might be like something I should dig into or a direction I should consider? I've made a few pretty big pivots in my career, like moving from one space into something thematically related, but quite different. And that's where having some of these people you trust that you can talk to for advice, but then also how can you get them to open some doors for you? And one of the tips I'll offer too, if you have anyone who gives you that kind of sort of mentoring guidance, is like, let them know how you've used their advice. Sometimes you can hesitate and say like, oh, they're really busy, I don't want to bug them. But then being on the other side, when I've given people advice, I've thought like, I wonder how that ended up. Did they take that job? I don't know. And so I've realized how much like, if you've had that conversation with someone, you want to know how it ends. And it again, just like reinforces that relationship and people get more and more invested in you and want to help. So anyways, think about the people who have supported you so far. And is there a way you can sort of engage them almost like a little bit more deeply in like more significant ways and keep them posted as you move through some experiences, especially if their advice or introductions have helped.
It's such a good thing. Everyone on this has access to their 10KC community, and like they get their smart matches and they're building their networks. And Christine, what you say, can't echo that enough, and take what you just shared and scream it from the mountaintops, which is, as you have those coffees and you're building your networks, follow up with these people. Don't ever think they're too busy, and share an article that might come across as an interesting follow-up. Say thank you, share a story of when potentially their advice has helped you in the wild after that conversation, but just follow up and stay in touch with people. And that's the path to turn new connections into things like mentors and sponsors. So a lot of people on this are potentially entering for their first job, or are alumni who might be transferring into new roles. There's a lot of people who are at important parts of their careers, and which is of course why networking and mentoring is so important. And so they're going to be applying for jobs, and they're going to be looking at organizations to see what they can, where's the best place to work. And so let's take this from the lens of women, but I think regardless, I think everyone, no matter what diversity background you might come from, should think about this as well. But from a women's perspective, as people are looking at different opportunities and finding different roles, what should people look out for as they're entering the workforce or joining a new company? Any like red flags or green flags, good things that people should look for? And Emma, maybe we'll start with you and then pass it to Christine.
Yeah, so for me, it's really looking not for perfection, but just for a company that's moving in the right direction, where you can see that good work is happening. It's just maybe taking a little bit longer. I think that when you are interviewing, or when they are interviewing you, you also need to be interviewing them. So you can get a sense of what the culture really is like based on the responses, or if you ask about diversity. or promotion for women, and they don't know the answer, then that might be, that would be a red flag for me. If you can also get a sense of whether the culture is reluctant to change at all, you know, that might be, I guess, a yellow flag, because you don't know how much change there will be coming. And then the final thing for me is that when you are interviewing them, you also want to see if you have values alignment. So if you can kind of see that your values are not aligned, it's probably not a long-term opportunity for you. So that, like, for me personally, I want to work for a company that we have the same values, and we're moving sort of in similar directions.
For me, I'd say, like, do as much homework as you can about what you can see from the outside. So for example, like, when and where do they talk about diversity? Do they only talk about diversity on International Women's Day or Black History Month? Or is this something that's talked about throughout the year? Do they advertise programs that they have at the company around mentorship, around networking? Do they talk about having employee resource groups? Bigger companies will even possibly have a diversity report that you can download from their website. This is if you like really want to dig in and like read what they say about themselves. Look at the leadership page on their website. Skim through the pictures. Do people look like you? If you have a sense of the team you'd be joining, look them up on LinkedIn. Same thing. But there's only so much you can read from outside. So definitely, like, I agree with Emma. How do you get stories from existing employees? It could be through the interview process, but also how do you find other people who work there who aren't necessarily part of the interview process? Alumni from your school, through LinkedIn, through 10,000 Coffees, through your career center. Like, how can you find someone who works there and have that sort of candid conversation about culture and how things operate and what leaders are like and values and so on? Because sometimes during the interview process, they can be trying to sell you on the role in the company and might put on like the rosiest lens on things. So how do you find someone who will have just kind of the candid conversation about the good and bad? Because it's important to go in eyes wide open. But I totally agree with Emma's sentiment. Like, you are interviewing them too. I know it doesn't always feel that way if you're like really looking for that first job, but to the extent you can land somewhere that's really a good match for you, you will just thrive. Like, you will be your best self at a place that's a good fit for you. So my hope is that you're able to find that.
Yeah, such good examples. So we have another poll question, and then as we're doing the poll, we have a question from the audience that I'd like to jump into, and so this is from Marlena. She's currently volunteering to mentor a woman, and she's struggling to find a job. I'm gonna paraphrase this. So she offered a chance to take on kind of a volunteer project with an organization that she's already volunteering with, but she said it's not what she wants to do, and she doesn't fully understand what's required for the project. And so she's kind of struggling to figure out, okay, well, how can I help this person to support them and sponsor them? What would you suggest for Marlena to help that person she's mentoring who's kind of turned down the opportunity she suggested?
I'll start and say, like, first of all, thank you for sort of brainstorming opportunities, finding projects. Are there any introductions you can make for her? Like, is there anyone in your network? One of the things I often suggest to people is I, connect with them on LinkedIn and then have them look through my network and say, like, is there anyone there that I could possibly introduce you to? So again, you put like some of the onus back on the person that you're trying to help to like make sure it's the right fit. So is there a company that she's interested in talking to? Can she find example roles where she's like, this is what I most want? Like any evidence that she can bring, because I know that feeling of like, you offer something, they're like, that's not quite right. And it's like, how do you get to what that thing is that could help? So she might need to bring you a little bit more, but if you can point her in the direction of your network or roles or whatever it is, that might just help get a productive conversation going.
Awesome. Emma, anything, just as the poll question is up, Emma, anything to add?
I think I would just add that you can sort of start small if there's anything within that project that she could be interested in. You can start with, she might be a little bit intimidated or not sure if she has the time, doesn't want to do a poor job. So I've definitely worked with people where they've asked me to take on a big project and I said, I can't do that right now, but I can start small and start with this little piece of it. And then it either grows or it doesn't grow because it wasn't a good fit. So that would be my advice.
Really good. And so just one kind of buzzer beater question as we're going to take down the poll from the audience. It's from an anonymous attendee. So thanks for the insightful conversation. I agree. What advice would you give to a stay-at-home mom wanting to go back to the corporate world? They decide to go back to school to bridge the gap and sometimes wonder if the gap years will affect being able to secure a job when school's done. Emma, do you want to kick off with some advice and we'll pass it to Christine?
Yeah, I think my advice would be just go for it. Don't make assumptions about what a company is going to think about your gap. I have a lot of recruiter friends who've actually said that they're no longer asking about the gap. They're not going to interview about the gap. They don't really care. So things are changing, and don't count yourself out. I'd say that.
I'd say the same, like just go for it, apply, see what kind of response you get. Being a mom myself, there are so many skills you build in that situation. So like, don't minimize that too. When you just think about the patience you might have built, the resilience, the creativity, the thinking on the fly. So there's a lot of good that comes from that. But what you might also want to do is take a look at companies that are actively recruiting via return to work programs. And the details are escaping me, but I feel like I remember at U of T, maybe through Rotman, through the School of Business, there were some programs for exactly that situation, women returning to the workforce after a leave. And even just like poke around which kind of companies sponsor those programs. They might be particularly interested in applications that fit your profile. So can you use some cues about companies where not only is it not a negative, but they're actively seeing the value in candidates who fit that profile.
Really, really good thoughts on that. And one other question that came in that I'll answer quickly. Actually, let's go to the poll and then we'll go to this other question. So how will you break the bias? Be an active ally. Amazing, tons of good ally resources. Seek out mentoring and networking opportunities. I shared the link 10,000copies.com/schools. Share that with your colleagues and classmates. It's free and it's a way for everyone to build mentoring and networking relationships, advocate for others, and speak up. And lots of people shared all those. So great, let's commit to all of that. A question that came in from Samira is just, how do you follow up with someone who does not respond to your emails, even though you made a connection at first? Should you keep following up? That's a really great question. And I would say, it takes at least 3 follow-ups for the most part to get some of these conversations. Oftentimes people think, oh, I got an email and now I'm just going to wait for it to get scheduled. It doesn't work that way. Everyone's very, very busy. And so from a 10KC perspective, it takes at least 3 follow-ups. And each of those follow-ups, use it as a way to share an article or catch up with them in a way. And just don't assume that it's a negative thing. A lot of people get hundreds of emails in the professional world and they just might miss it. So have a good subject line, share some articles, and just don't, one of the best rules is just don't get negative. We've seen some people follow up saying like being passive aggressive or negative, where it's like, well, maybe you actually don't care, so I'm going to follow up one more time. Don't go there. Stay positive, stay friendly, and stay on top of it. So we're somehow almost finishing up on time. So I have a kind of a final question for both of you. What do you wish you could tell your younger self when you were just starting out in your career? And Christine, maybe we'll start with you and go to Emma.
Oh my goodness. I feel like I would tell my younger self so much. One is don't try to plan so much. Like I'm a researcher, that's where I started my career. I'm someone who likes to get all the data, make a really informed decision, but honestly, many roles I've had didn't exist until I took that job. So if I tried to write a script and stick to it, I would have missed out on so many opportunities. That was one, like don't plan too much. Another one would have been that your network takes nurturing. Like stay in touch with people who have added value, or who you want to support in their careers. Ping them in a small way, even to say hello. I'm still not as good at this as I probably should be, so it's good for me to take my own advice right now. But if you're thinking about someone reflecting on a difference they made, a couple of people who I didn't mention them by name, but managers who have had an effect on me, I should probably go and ping them and say, hey, by the way, I mentioned you on a call today, and I still think about how you supported me as I was navigating my career. Careers are long. You might cross paths with the same people over and over again and have opportunities to support each other in ways you can't even think of right now. So just like stay close to the people, like the relationships that you're building now.
Yeah, that's really, really good advice. This one's not really linked to networking or sponsorship or anything like that, but one thing that I wish I would have done, and it's just kind of coming to light now some years later, is setting yourself up for success when you're younger and putting in place support systems. So, figuring out what de-stresses you and what you can use to take care of yourself when things get really busy, especially as you move forward in your careers. Burnout is growing at a much faster rate for women than it is for men, especially with COVID. So I wish years ago I would have put in some of these support systems or just sort of things to set myself up for success down the road. And the best advice that I ever got was to do these things proactively. Don't wait until you're on the verge of burnout to put these in place. So look for those systems now.
Yeah, I think I wish watched this recording over and over again a few times on those younger self tips, because on both fronts, like nurturing your network, I know you always don't think the world's that small. And if there's anything you kind of learn through your 20s and through kind of the first few years of your career, it's like the world's very small. And so building your network is one of the best. People talk about buying assets like stocks and investing. Well, your network is actually like a stock. It's an investment that you should be putting your time into all the time. And Emma, to your point around burnout, like it's a marathon, and you've got to take care of yourself. You've got to find ways for mindfulness and for gratitude and for physical health. And really it's a marathon and not a sprint. We're going to just share a slide here because we only have a couple more minutes left. So just as I have one more question that we're going to get to from the audience, but just as we're doing that, we will send out a survey. So share your thoughts, share some kind words that we'll pass along to the panelists. Also, just share some of your thoughts on social as well. We'll be following along. And finally, I think the more that people can network and mentor, it's a critical part of allyship and inclusion and creating more inclusive places. So, as part of RBC Future Launch, every school gets access to this for free so that you can help everybody build their networks and get access to mentoring. So share that link with classmates or your school to get more people building their networks. So as we're closing out, one kind of buzzer beater question that came in from an anonymous attendee is that as a woman, they've identified that sometimes it feels like women are in competition with each other in the workplace, less so than their male counterparts. Any advice on how to mitigate this feeling to help create a more supportive environment for women? Christine, maybe I'll start with you and then pass it to Emma as we wrap up.
Yeah, it's interesting. We heard that narrative, but our research showed that women were more likely to mentor and sponsor other women. Men were more likely to mentor and sponsor other men. Like people tended to build those relationships with people who looked like them. So our research didn't really sort of support that statement, but definitely there are examples we can all point to. I think we can all just be part of the change that, like the culture that we want to see. Culture is just how people interact. So if you're visibly supporting other women, if you look for the senior women who are doing that, because I am certain they're out there, thank them for it, call it out, tell that story. I tend to bias towards celebrating the positive and like trying to reinforce that and hold those folks up as role models. So I'd say if you look for it, you'll find it, and make that part of the narrative of this is how we operate here.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, Christine, that the research didn't necessarily show it, because I sometimes wonder if it's true that this is happening more, or is it just that we are more disappointed with it because it's not how we want things to go. And so I think great advice from Christine, which is just, don't do this yourself, model good behavior, model the kind of behavior that you want the rest of your team to show. And then hopefully that's just part of the culture. It also probably goes towards what we talked about in terms of finding the company or the organization that you want to work with, and hopefully finding that that's not an issue there to start with.
Yeah, such good advice. So we're at time somehow, and thank you so much to Emma and Christine and Jill, our three panelists and the people behind this webinar. Really, I hope if anything out of this webinar, people are going to find ways to celebrate International Women's Day every day, and whether they're women or whether they're allies, it's something that we can all play a part in. So thank you to both of you, and to Jill and the team to make this happen. Really great advice, and we'll share a recording to everybody after this so they have a copy. Okay, well, with that, we can all wrap up, and have a great rest of the week.
Thanks, bye.
Thanks.